Okay, little change of plan. This is gonna be for Max, so he can go to bed. A little bedtime story for anybody at 8:24. On what is it, Thursday? Wow, Thursday already. All right. Treasure Island, Robert Louis Stevenson, Chapter 3, The Black Spot. The next afternoon, I stopped to bring the captain some cooling drinks and medicine. He was lying very much as we had left him the day before. Although he was still weak, he seemed excited.
"Jim," he said, "you're the only one here that I can depend upon. You know that I've been giving you a silver coin every month I've been here. I'm pretty low now, but do you think you could bring me a glass of rum?"
I tried to tell him what the doctor had said, but he dismissed it as nonsense. As he talked and tried to convince me how badly he needed the rum, his voice grew louder. I was thinking only of my father, who needed quiet, and I agreed to get him the rum if he would be still. Then he asked me how long the doctor said he would be in bed. When I told him it would be at least a week, he looked angry.
"Thunder!" he cried. "A week's more than I have. They will have the black spot on me by then. I won't let him get me this time. I swear to it."
As he was speaking, he tried to get out of bed, but he collapsed in weakness.
"Jim," he said, "that black dog, he was a bad one. But there are worse out there to get me. Now, if I can't get away, they'll tip me the black spot. Mind you, it's my old sea chest that they're after. You get on a horse and go to that doctor. Tell him to send all the men he can find here to the inn. All of the old Flint's crew will be here. I was Flint's first mate, and I'm the only one who knows where it is. He gave it to me as a child." Oh, did I screw up a page? Yeah, no. Gave it as a child. He gave it to me as he died. But don't tell this to anyone unless they give me the black spot, or you see Black Dog, or that man with the one leg.
None of this made any sense to me at all. I asked him again and again what the black spot was and who Flint was, but he slowly drifted into sleep. I scarcely had time to think about what the captain had told me, when my poor father in the other room took a turn for the worse and died suddenly. My sadness, the visits of our friends, and all the details of the funeral made me forget my strange conversation with the captain. So things passed until the day after the funeral. At about 3 o'clock, I was standing at the door, full of sad thoughts about my father, when I saw someone coming towards the inn. He was obviously blind, for he tapped in front of himself with a stick and wore dark glasses over his eyes. He was hunched over and wore a huge tattered sea cloak with a hood. I never saw a more dreadful-looking creature. He stopped a little ways from the inn and said in a sing-song voice, "Will someone tell a poor blind man where or in what part of the country this is? Or he is?" I told the man that he was at the Admiral Benbow Inn at Black Hill Cove. With that, he asked me to show him inside. When he gripped my hand, he held on like a vice and pulled me close to him.
"Now, boy," he said, "take me to the captain."
I tried to refuse, but he gave me a wrench that made me cry out. Then, holding me with his iron grasp, he made me lead him upstairs to the sick man's room. When the captain raised his eyes, I saw in them a look of fear and weakness. He tried to rise, but he didn't have the strength.
"Now, Bill, sit where you are," said the blind man. "Even though I can't see, I can hear if you move a finger. Now you, Jim, take his left hand and bring it close to mine."
We both obeyed him to the letter. I saw him pass something from his hand to the captain's hand.
"And now that's done," said the blind man.
As he walked slowly out of the inn, I could hear his sick tapping into the distance. It was some time before either I or the captain seemed to gather our senses. When I let go of his wrist, he drew his hand and looked into his palm.
10 o'clock, he cried. 6 hours! I'll escape them yet!
And he sprang to his feet. As he did this, he grabbed at his throat, swayed for a moment, and then fell with a loud thud upon the floor. I ran to him at once and called my mother. The captain had died of a stroke. Although I never liked the man, when I saw him there on the floor, I burst into a flood of tears. It was the second death I had known, and the sorrow of the first was still fresh in my heart. Glorfindel, good to see you. Treasure Island. Why not? Because why not? Chapter 4, The Sea Chest. This is the kids' version. Great illustrated classics. The Sea Chest. I lost no time, of course, in telling my mother all that I knew about the captain and his strange visitors. Some of the dead man's money, if he had any, was certainly due us. I could not ride away to the doctor's as the captain had asked me to do, since it would both leave my mother unprotected and alone. Both of us were too frightened to stay in the house. The dead body on the parlor floor and the thought of the blind man hovering near, ready to return, filled us with all sorts of fears. So the two of us ran out to the frosty evening to get some help from the villagers. When we reached the village, I felt relieved to see the yellow lights in doors and windows, but to our disappointment, no one would return us to the inn. After I told my story, everyone turned away in fear. The name of Captain Flint was well known to some of the people there. Some of the men had heard tales of cruelty about him and his infamous crew. After everyone declined to return with us, my mother stood up and with great courage declared that she would not lose the money that rightfully belonged to her fatherless son. "If none of the rest of you dare," she said, "Jim and I will go back. Small thanks to you big, hulking, chicken-hearted men. We'll open that chest if we have to die doing it." Of course, I went with my mother, but my heart was thumping with fear as we set out into the cold night. We slipped along the hedges, silently and swiftly, but we did not see or hear anything to increase our terrors, and soon we were safely back inside the inn. I slipped the bolt at once. We stood and panted for a moment in the dark. We were alone with the dead captain's body. Then my mother little lit a candle. Holding each other's hands, we advanced into the parlor. He lay as we had left him, on his back, with his eyes open and one arm stretched out. "Draw the blinds, Jim," whispered my mother. "We have to get the key off his body. It must be there somewhere." I went down on my knees at once. On the floor close to his hand was a little piece of paper. It was blackened on one side. This must have been the black spot. On the other side was this short message: "You have till 10 tonight." I looked up at the clock. It was almost 6. We still had 4 hours. I felt in the dead man's pockets, but all I found were some coins and bits of tobacco. "Perhaps it's around his neck," suggested my mother. I closed my eyes as I tore open his shirt. Sure enough, hanging on a bit of string was a small silver key. I cut the string and we hurried upstairs to open the chest. It was like any other seaman's chest on the outside. The initial B was burned into the top with a hot iron, and the corners were smashed and broken. We unlocked the lid and opened the chest. A strong smell of tobacco rose from inside. We unpacked the contents layer by layer. There were some clothes, pistols, a Spanish watch, a compass, and many trinkets. But at the very bottom we found a bundle of papers tied up with an oilcloth sack and a purse filled with gold coins. "I'll show these rascals that I'm an honest woman," said my mother. "I'll only take what he owed us and not a penny more." She began to count out the amount from the captain's debt. It was a difficult task, since the coins came from so many different countries, and neither of us knew their exact worth. When we were about halfway through, I suddenly heard a sound. It was the tap, tap, tapping of the blind man's stick upon the frozen road. I urged my mother to take the money and make a fast escape, but my mother, frightened as she was unwilling to take a cent more or a cent less than what was rightfully due to us. But when she heard the sound of approaching footsteps, she decided to take what she had already counted. I kept the papers and the oilcloth sack, and we left by the back door. We had only reached the outside of the inn when we could hear a group of men knocking at the front door. My mother and I began to run. "My dear," she said, "take the money and the papers and run on ahead. I'm going to faint." But I wouldn't leave her. This was certainly the end for both of us, I thought. Somehow we made it to the little wooden bridge, and I helped her cross. As soon as we reached the other side, she collapsed in a dead faint. I managed to drag her to a spot where we could not be seen, but where we could hear everything that was happening inside the inn. Chapter 5. The Last of the Blind Man. My curiosity was greater than my fear, and I crept even closer to the inn, so that I could see and hear what was happening. There were 7 or 8 men pounding at the heavy oak door. Even through the mist, I could see the blind man. I heard his voice as he shouted to break down the door. The men obeyed him, and in a flash, the door was ripped from its hinges. Once they were inside, I heard one of the men shout in surprise that Bill was dead. "Search him and find the chest!" cried the blind man. A few seconds later, the window of the captain's room was thrown open, and a man leaned out and shouted that someone had already gotten to the chest. "The money's still here," shouted one of the men. "Curse the money!" shouted the blind man. "Is Flint's packet still there?" Obviously, the blind man was not interested in the money in Bill's trunk. He wanted the packet of papers that I now held close to my beating heart. After the men shouted down that the papers were nowhere to be seen, the blind man ordered them to find my mother and me. He knew that we must have taken what he wanted, but the men had enough. They were satisfied with the gold coins and were unwilling to obey the harsh orders of the blind man. Soon a quarrel began. The men all threatened each other, and then the blind man. The quarrel saved us. While it was still raging, another sound came from the top of the hill, the sound of approaching horses. The next sound I heard was a pistol shot, which was a warning of danger. As soon as they heard the shot, the men scattered in all directions. Only the blind man remained, tapping up and down the road in a frenzy and calling for his mates. He took a wrong turn and began walking straight towards the approaching horses. He immediately realized his error and turned with a scream. He ran straight for a ditch, fell, and then got up again. But it was too late, for one horse was already upon him. He went down with a cry that rang high into the night. The 4 hooves trampled him to death. I leapt to my feet and hailed the riders. They were men who had heard our trouble and had decided to come help us. They quickly revived my mother, but the blind man was stone dead. We all went back to the inn, which had been ransacked and almost destroyed by the men who had searched it. I knew at once that the packet of papers I held must be very valuable. I asked the men if they would ride with me to Dr. Livesley's house right away. They seemed to understand my urgency, and we set out at once. Chapter 6, The Captain's Papers. Well, it's getting close for me to do a client call, so I think I'll leave it there tonight. But that there's the story. A couple chapters of Treasure Island. Just a short little ditty here tonight. Gotta do a call with the client. I'll be back. I think we're buying Sea of Thieves, which is why I wanted to read a little bit of Treasure Island. Very excited for Sea of Thieves. See how that goes. All right. Well, thanks for popping in, everybody. Have a great night.